travel used to feel exciting to me. New cities, unfamiliar streets, hotel lobbies that all looked strangely similar no matter where you were. I traveled alone a lot for work in my 20s, and after enough trips, hotels stopped feeling temporary. This happened 4 years ago after I'd taken a week off from work in October. Tourist season had just ended, but a handful of hotels and restaurants were still open on the island. That sounded perfect to me. No crowds. No waiting in lines. Just a few days with my camera and some hiking trails. The first thing I tucked into my wallet after arriving was a faded ferry ticket. I usually threw them away, but something made me keep this one. The island had one small harbor, a grocery store, 2 inns, and fewer than 200 year-round residents. The first day was exactly what I'd hoped for. I walked rocky beaches, photographed old fishing boats, had dinner at a small seafood restaurant overlooking the water. There were still tourists around. Not many. Maybe 15 or 20 people altogether. The second morning felt different. The parking lot outside my inn was half empty. The couple staying in the room next to mine had already checked out. At breakfast, I overheard 2 hikers talking. Storm's supposed to roll in tomorrow. I'm catching the afternoon ferry instead. I checked the weather on my phone. Cloudy. Some rain. Nothing unusual. By late afternoon, more cars had disappeared. The gift shop closed 2 hours earlier than advertised. The woman behind the counter smiled politely as I left. "You heading out tomorrow?" "I've still got one more night." Her smile faded slightly. "Oh." That was all she said. After sunset, the harbor looked almost abandoned. Only a few lights remained on across the waterfront. The following morning, I walked to the ferry dock to photograph the sunrise. The ferry captain recognized me from the day before. "You staying another night?" "I paid for 3. He looked toward the empty parking lot, then back at me. I wouldn't. Before I could ask why, he climbed aboard and began preparing for departure. I stood there confused. When the ferry pulled away, I realized something. I was the only passenger left standing on the dock. Everyone else had boarded. By noon, nearly every parked car was gone. The cafe closed before lunch. The grocery store locked its doors. Even the innkeeper seemed distracted. When I asked if everything was okay, he simply said, "Quiet week." Nothing more. I decided to spend the afternoon hiking a trail that circled the northern cliffs. Halfway through the hike, I noticed fresh tire tracks crossing a maintenance road. Large trucks. Several of them. Odd. There weren't many vehicles on the island anymore. The tracks didn't head toward town. They disappeared into a wooded service road marked authorized access only. I kept walking. About 20 minutes later, I heard engines. Not one. Several. They were coming from somewhere beyond the trees. Curious, I climbed onto a rocky overlook. Below me, hidden inside an abandoned quarry near the shoreline, were 6 cargo trucks parked in a circle. Men unloaded large wooden crates using portable forklifts. None of the crates had shipping labels. One truck backed toward a small fishing dock hidden from the main harbor. Another group rolled blue plastic barrels into a warehouse built into the cliff. No one wore company uniforms. No logos. No marked vehicles. One man suddenly looked uphill. Toward me. I dropped behind the rocks. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Footsteps echoed below. Voices. One of them shouted, "Check the trail." I didn't wait. Instead of running back the way I'd come, I followed a narrow deer path that descended toward the eastern shoreline. Branches scraped my jacket. Loose stones slid beneath my boots. Behind me, I heard people crashing through the brush. They weren't shouting anymore. That scared me more. They already knew where I was going. The deer trail eventually opened onto a strip of rocky beach. About 50 yards offshore sat an old lobster boat tied to a weathered buoy. An elderly fisherman was loading traps into the boat. Without thinking, I sprinted toward him. He looked up just once, then glanced toward the tree line behind me. He didn't ask questions. He simply untied the rope and motioned for me to climb aboard. The engine coughed to life. Just as we pulled away from shore, 3 men emerged from the trees. They stopped at the water's edge. None of them yelled. None of them waved. They simply watched us leave. The fisherman didn't speak until the island had nearly disappeared behind us. Finally, he said, "That's why nobody stays after the last ferry." I turned to ask what he meant. He shook his head. "I've lived here 40 years. Some things are safe for not knowing." He dropped me at the mainland harbor before sunset and refused to take any money. I drove home that night instead of finishing my vacation. The faded ferry ticket from that trip is still tucked inside my passport. Every now and then I look at it and remember one detail I didn't notice until weeks later. Printed across the bottom, almost worn away by my wallet, was a small line I'd never bothered to read before. Final scheduled passenger service of the season. I still wonder why every local seemed to know that mattered. And why I was the only visitor who didn't.
Last spring, I decided to spend a week traveling alone through Seattle, Portland, and Eugene before starting a new job. I'd saved enough money to take one last trip, and I wanted it to be slow. No rushing from attraction to attraction. Just trains, bookstores, local cafes, and whatever I happened to discover. I kept every ticket from the trip folded inside my wallet. By the end of the week, one folded train ticket became the only souvenir I cared about. The first time I noticed him was in Seattle. I was sitting near the window of a small coffee shop, planning my route for the day, when a man in a gray baseball cap walked past outside. Nothing unusual. Average height. Dark jacket. Messenger bag. Maybe mid-40s. He glanced through the window for a second before continuing down the block. I forgot about him almost immediately. That afternoon, I saw him again outside Pike Place Market. He was standing near a flower stand, looking in my direction. I remember thinking he looked familiar. Then a crowd crossed between us, and he disappeared. Seattle is a busy city. Seeing the same person twice isn't strange. The next morning I boarded an early train to Portland. Halfway through the ride, I walked to the cafe car for coffee. As I came back, I looked through the window into the next carriage. The man in the gray cap was sitting alone, reading a newspaper. I froze for a second. Then I laughed at myself. Thousands of people traveled that route every week. Maybe he was taking the same vacation. Maybe we just happened to have similar plans. That explanation made perfect sense. Until Portland. The second evening, I checked into a small downtown hotel. Around sunset, I walked to a food truck parked for dinner. As I crossed the street, I noticed someone sitting on a bench across the intersection. Gray cap. Dock jacket. Messenger bag. He wasn't eating. He wasn't using his phone. He was simply watching the people crossing the street. When the signal changed, I deliberately turned in the opposite direction and entered a crowded bookstore instead. I stayed inside nearly 40 minutes. When I finally walked out, the bench was empty. I never saw where he went. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I changed my plans. Instead of visiting a museum, I spent the day in busy public places. Every few hours, I'd casually look around. Nothing. I started feeling embarrassed. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. The following morning, I boarded another train. Destination Eugene. I told myself that if I saw him again, I'd stop making excuses. The train arrived just after noon. I stepped onto the platform carrying my backpack and suitcase. As I unfolded my train ticket to check the station exit, I looked across the tracks. There he was, standing perfectly still, watching me. He wasn't waiting near an arriving train. He wasn't meeting anyone. The moment our eyes met, he turned and walked away. Not fast, not slow, just enough to disappear behind the station building. For the first time, I felt genuine fear. I didn't chase him. Instead, I did something I hadn't planned. I walked back inside the station and bought a ticket on the next departing regional train. Not because I wanted to leave Eugene, because I wanted to know if he expected me to stay. I sat near a window where I could watch the entrance. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Just before boarding began, the man walked into the station. He wasn't looking at the departure screens. He slowly scanned the waiting area, searching. When his eyes reached the chair where I'd been sitting earlier, he stopped. I was no longer there. I'd quietly moved upstairs to an enclosed seating area overlooking the lobby. From there, I watched him circle the station twice. He checked the cafe, the restrooms, the platform entrance. He even walked outside and came back in. He wasn't wandering. He was trying to find someone. Me. My train began boarding. Instead of using the main platform, I exited through a secondary staircase at the far end of the station and boarded from another carriage. Just before the doors closed, I looked back through the window. He suddenly appeared on the platform. His head turned from window to window, scanning each car. Then the train started moving. He broke into a run for several seconds before slowing to a stop. He never waved, never shouted, never even changed his expression. He simply stood there until the station disappeared behind a curve. I ended my trip a day early and flew home instead of following my original itinerary. I never saw him again. That folded train ticket from Eugene is still tucked inside my passport. Sometimes I think about throwing it away, but every time I hold it, I remember one small detail that still unsettles me. When I bought that last-minute ticket, I paid in cash. I never used a travel app, never updated my reservation. No one should have known I was leaving that afternoon. Yet somehow, he was already inside the station before the departure was ever announced.
3 years ago, when I was traveling to Denver for a regional sales conference, I was 28, lived alone, and spent enough time traveling that my friends joked I knew hotel layouts better than my own apartment. I always carried the same black backpack and kept one habit no matter where I stayed. The moment I checked in, I would lightly scratch one corner of my room key with my thumbnail so I could identify it instantly if I accidentally mixed it with old cards. That trip, the scratch turned into a small crack near the bottom edge. A tiny detail, one I still remember. I landed late because of a delayed flight and reached the hotel a little after 11. The lobby was nearly empty. The front desk employee looked exhausted. He handed me 2 key cards. Room 814. I only took one. The second stayed on the counter. I specifically remember that because he asked if I was sure. I was. I always traveled light. The room looked normal. I unpacked, showered, set my alarm, and went to sleep. Nothing strange happened that first night. The next morning I left for the conference around 8 and didn't return until almost 6. When I entered my room, the bed was made and fresh towels had been left in the bathroom. Housekeeping. Normal. Except I always hang the "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. It was gone. I assumed I forgot. That happens when you're tired. Later that night I noticed something else. My toothbrush had been moved. Not dramatically. Just rotated the opposite direction on the bathroom counter. I stared at it for a few seconds before laughing at myself. Travel messes with your memory. I told myself I was imagining things. The second day was busier. Dinner with clients. Networking. Too much coffee. When I got back to the hotel around 10, I found my room exactly the way I'd left it. No issues. No missing items. I started feeling stupid for being paranoid. Before bed, I placed my cracked key card on the nightstand while I showered. Afterward, I slipped it back into my wallet. I remember doing it. Clearly. The next morning, I used that same card to leave the room. At least I thought I did. That night I returned from the conference and opened the door. The television was on. I never left televisions running. My suitcase sat beside the dresser. My laptop remained untouched. Nothing looked disturbed. Then I saw it. My cracked key card. Sitting in the center of the bed. My hand immediately went to my wallet. Empty. I checked every pocket. Nothing. The card on the bed was mine. There was no doubt. Same crack. Same worn corner. My first thought was that I had somehow dropped it. But that made no sense. You needed the card to access the elevator. I had used it less than a minute earlier. I picked it up. It was warm. Not hot. Just. Not room temperature. I suddenly had the overwhelming feeling that someone had been inside that room moments before I arrived. I left immediately. I didn't run. I didn't want anyone watching to know I was scared. I walked down the hallway, entered the elevator, and went straight to the lobby. The front desk employee was different now. I explained everything. He checked the electronic access log. My room had been opened twice while I was at the conference, once by housekeeping, and once using a guest key card. He frowned. There shouldn't be another active guest key. My stomach dropped. He asked if I wanted a new room. I said no. I wanted a different hotel. Immediately, I grabbed my backpack from the luggage room and left without even returning upstairs. I spent the rest of the trip at another hotel across the city. I never found out who used that second key. Maybe the front desk made a mistake. Maybe someone duplicated it. Maybe there had always been 2 active cards and the employee simply forgot. There's probably a reasonable explanation. But here's the part one still think about. When I emptied my wallet after getting home, I found an old expired hotel key from a trip months earlier. I'd been carrying it without realizing, which means the card I used to access the elevator that final night couldn't have been mine. I still travel for work, but now whenever I check into a hotel, I never let the staff hand me 2 keys, and I never sleep through the first night.